Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Death Valley. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the spring of 1897, 3 men from the California Historical Society ventured into the Funeral Mountains on the eastern edge of Death Valley. Their mission was simple: to document the abandoned mining settlements scattered throughout the region. What they discovered in one remote homestead would remain unspoken for nearly 2 decades. The day was unusually cool for Death Valley, with a dry wind that seemed to carry whispers across the cracked earth. As the historians approached the dilapidated Lockwood property, once a promising silver mining venture, they noted that, unlike other abandoned homesteads, this one showed signs of deliberate isolation. The path leading to it had been obscured with rocks and desert brush, as if someone had intentionally tried to erase its existence from the landscape. The property sat nestled against the foothills, partially sheltered from the harsh desert elements. The main house, a 2-story structure built of imported timber and local stone, stood in stark contrast to the typical miner's shack. This had been a home of relative prosperity, but something was wrong. The historians noted in their journal that despite being abandoned for what appeared to be at least a decade, no scavengers had disturbed the property. In a region where every nail and board was precious, the Lockwood house remained untouched, avoided. One of the historians, a professor named Crawford, wrote, "The house presents itself as a perfect time capsule, yet no local will acknowledge its existence when questioned. It is as if the entire settlement has agreed to forget." The men entered through the front door, which opened with surprising ease. Inside, they found furnishings draped in sheets that had long since gathered a thick layer of dust. The parlor contained a piano with sheet music still open to Chopin's Funeral March. The kitchen held dishes stacked neatly in cupboards. Everything suggested the inhabitants had not fled in panic, but had methodically departed or disappeared. It was on the 2nd floor, however, that the historians encountered what they would later describe only as a room that defies rational explanation. At the end of a long hallway stood a door, unlike the others in the house. It was reinforced with iron bands and featured no fewer than 6 separate locks, all on the outside. The historians would later recall that the hallway seemed to grow colder as they approached this door. "We debated whether to open it," Crawford wrote in his account. "Something in the construction of that door suggested it was designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep something in." Using tools from their saddlebags, the men worked for nearly an hour to break the locks. The final tumbler gave way with an audible click that seemed to echo throughout the empty house. The door, however, did not swing open as expected. It remained firmly in place, as if held shut by some unseen force. Finally, with the combined strength of all 3 men, the door scraped open, releasing a gust of stale air that carried what Crawford described as the lingering memory of fear. The room beyond was small, no more than 10 feet square, with a single window sealed with wooden planks. Scratches covered the interior walls from floor to ceiling, thousands upon thousands of them, some forming what appeared to be words or symbols now rendered illegible by their sheer quantity and overlap. In the center of the room stood a chair, bolted to the floor. Leather restraints hung from its arms and legs, frayed but intact. Behind it, painted on the wall in what laboratory analysis would later confirm was a mixture of plant dye and human blood, was a crude family tree. Names had been written and then violently scratched out, all except one: Agatha Lockwood, Matriarch. Most disturbing of all was a collection of small cloth dolls, arranged in a perfect circle around the chair. Each doll was crudely fashioned to resemble a person, with distinguishing features made from bits of actual human hair and cloth that appeared to be cut from clothing. Each bore a name tag sewn into its chest, names of Lockwood family members and various townsfolk from the nearby settlement of Furnace Creek. The historians gathered the dolls and a leather-bound journal they discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard before sealing the room again. That night, as they camped several miles from the property, all three men reported experiencing the same nightmare, a woman's voice reciting names over and over in an emotionless monotone. By morning, Crawford had developed a high fever and insisted they return immediately to San Francisco. The dolls and journal were submitted to the Historical Society, but were classified and sealed away within a week of their arrival. Crawford resigned his position shortly thereafter and reportedly moved to Europe, where he lived as a recluse until his death in 1916. The story of what happened to the Lockwood family and why their matriarch's room had been sealed so thoroughly might have remained buried forever, had it not been for a young archivist named Eleanor Marsh, who, in 1914, discovered the sealed records while reorganizing the Society's repository. Marsh, whose meticulous notes form the backbone of this account, spent years piecing together the Lockwood family history from fragments of public records, newspaper clippings, and the partially burned journal recovered from the room. The Lockwoods arrived in Death Valley in 1873 during the silver mining boom. Thaddius Lockwood, a Boston banker fallen on hard times, brought his wife Agatha and their 4 children to California with dreams of restoring their fortune. They were accompanied by Agatha's unmarried sister, Constance Reed, described in contemporary accounts as a woman of fragile constitution and nervous disposition. Unlike most miners who lived in crude shacks, Thaddius constructed a proper home for his family, determined to maintain the standards of their previous life. The house was completed in 1875, and for several years the family prospered. Thaddius's mine yielded enough silver to ensure comfort, if not the wealth he had hoped for. Contemporary accounts from the mining community describe the Lockwoods as private but respected. Thaddius was seen regularly in Furnace Creek conducting business and occasionally joining other men for drinks at the local saloon. The children attended the small schoolhouse established for the miners' families. Agatha, however, rarely left the property. Those who encountered her described a tall, imposing woman with a penetrating gaze and precise manner of speaking. A shopkeeper's wife wrote in her diary, "Mrs. Lockwood speaks as if measuring each word before releasing it, like a miser counting coins. Her eyes never seem to blink, and one gets the distinct feeling of being assessed rather than seen." The first indication that something was amiss came in 1878, when Thaddius abruptly withdrew the children from school. A letter to the teachers cited the need for them to focus on family responsibilities and private education, more suited to their station. That same year, the family ceased attending the monthly social gatherings in town. Deliveries of supplies were no longer received by the children or Thaddius, but by Agatha alone. The delivery boy from the general store reported that she would meet him at the edge of the property, never allowing him to approach the house. In 1879, Constance Reed suddenly departed for San Francisco. The only record of her leaving is a stagecoach manifest and a cryptic note sent to a childhood friend back east. "I can no longer bear witness to what occurs within those walls. May God forgive me for abandoning them, but I fear I shall lose my own mind if I stay." For the next 5 years, the family receded further from public view. Thaddius continued to work his mine, but witnesses described him as increasingly gaunt and withdrawn. One mining colleague wrote, "Old Lockwood has the look of a man who hasn't slept in months. His hands shake something terrible, and he startles at the smallest sound. Asked him once how the family was getting on, and he just stared at me like he'd forgotten he had one." Then, in the harsh winter of 1884, tragedy struck. During a rare snowstorm, Thaddius's eldest son, Franklin, age 16, reportedly fell from a second-story window of the house. The local doctor was summoned, but the boy was dead upon his arrival. The doctor's report, discovered by Marsh in the county records, contained several troubling observations. The boy's injuries, he noted, were inconsistent with a fall. Furthermore, He documented unusual marks on the boy's wrists and ankles, consistent with prolonged restraint and evidence of malnourishment. When he attempted to discuss these concerns with Thaddius, he was ordered off the property by Agatha, who appeared suddenly with a shotgun. The doctor reported his concerns to the county sheriff, but no investigation followed. The sheriff was preoccupied with a series of armed robberies plaguing the main road to Los Angeles. Franklin was buried on the property rather than in the town cemetery. No funeral service was held, and no neighbors or friends were invited to pay respects. Within a month of the boy's death, Thaddius stopped working his mine altogether. The family was next seen in town in April of 1885 when Thaddius arrived with his wife and remaining children to sell his mining claim. Witnesses described the children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from 10 to 15 years of age, as unnaturally quiet and moving in perfect unison, like parts of a single organism. Agatha conducted most of the business, while Thaddius stood silently beside her. The sale was completed for far less than the claim's value, with the money paid in cash. This was the last confirmed sighting of the entire family together. What happened in the years that followed remains shrouded in mystery. No death certificates exist for any of the Lockwoods. No property records indicate a sale of their house. They simply vanished from public record, as if the desert had swallowed them whole. But the house remained, and within it, that terrible room with its restraints, its scratched walls, and its circle of dolls, silent witnesses to whatever horror had unfolded there. In June of 1885, approximately 2 months after the family's last appearance in town, a prospector passing near the Lockwood property reported hearing a woman's voice reciting what sounded like Bible verses, but all wrong somehow, all mixed up with other words that made no sense. He did not investigate, attributing the sound to the wind or his own exhaustion. That same month, a young man employed at the general store attempted to deliver a package that had arrived for Thaddius. He reported being met at the edge of the property by Agatha, alone. She took the package, but refused to allow him to approach the house, despite the blazing midday heat. He noted that she appeared uncommonly strong for a woman of her years, and that her dress was stained with what he believed to be soil, as if she had been digging. The final documented encounter with any member of the Lockwood family occurred in November of 1885. A hunting party, having strayed far from their intended path, came upon Agatha standing alone in the desert nearly 5 miles from her home. It was dawn, and the men reported that she appeared to have been out all night, dressed only in a nightgown, despite the bitter cold. According to their account, she showed no surprise at their presence, nor any distress at her situation. She simply stared at them for several long moments before asking, "Have you come to be purified?" Unsettled, the men offered to escort her home, but she turned and walked away, disappearing among the rocks of the foothills. The men reported the incident upon their return to Furnace Creek, but the sheriff, finding the story too bizarre and the men somewhat intoxicated, dismissed their concerns. No search was conducted. By 1886, the mining boom was fading. Families began to leave Furnace Creek for more promising opportunities elsewhere. By 1890, the once bustling settlement had dwindled to a handful of stubborn holdouts. None reported any sign of the Lockwoods, though occasional rumors circulated of light seen in the distant house, or a woman's silhouette observed standing motionless on the porch for hours at a time. It would be another 7 years before the historians from the California Historical Society would discover the abandoned property and the nightmare it contained, 7 years during which the desert winds scoured away footprints and the sun bleached away all but the most stubborn traces of what had occurred. Eleanor Marsh's investigation, conducted surreptitiously over several years, gradually revealed a pattern of disturbing coincidences surrounding the Lockwood family. Agatha's maiden name, she discovered, was Blackwood, a family with a troubling history in Salem, Massachusetts. Ancestors had been implicated, though never tried, in connection with a series of disappearances in 1690, just before the infamous witch trials. More telling was what Marsh uncovered about Agatha's life before her marriage to Thaddius. Records from a private sanitarium outside Boston showed that a young Agatha Blackwood had been committed for treatment in 1855 at the age of 17. She remained there for 3 years, diagnosed with moral insanity and religious melancholia. The attending physician's notes, partially preserved, described a patient obsessed with notions of spiritual corruption and purification. She describes elaborate rituals involving isolation, recitation, and what she refers to as the extraction of the corrupted elements. When pressed on what these elements might be, she becomes agitated and refuses further discussion. Agatha was released in 1858, declared much improved and showing appropriate feminine deference and rational behavior. 6 months later, she married Thaddius Lockwood, a banking colleague of her father's, despite being nearly 20 years his junior. The patient believes human bodies can be cleansed of sin through systematic methods, one entry read. Their first child, Franklin, was born in 1868, followed by 3 more children in quick succession. The family lived a life of apparent normalcy and privilege in Boston until 1873, when Thaddius's bank failed amid accusations of mismanagement. Rather than face his creditors, he liquidated what assets remained and fled west with his family. What drove a respectable banker to the harsh extremes of Death Valley rather than to more established communities in California remains unknown, but Marsh's research suggested a possible motive beyond mere financial desperation. Newspaper archives from Boston revealed that in the months before the bank's collapse, 3 children from families connected to Thaddius's social circle had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The cases remained unsolved, but Marsh discovered a disturbing connection. Each child had been a playmate of the Lockwood children and had been invited to the Lockwood home shortly before vanishing. No formal accusations were ever made against the family, but Marsh uncovered a sealed police report in which a housemaid formerly employed by the Lockwoods reported finding strange drawings hidden in Agatha's prayer book, crude human figures surrounded by written passages in what appeared to be Latin, but which made no grammatical sense. The maid also reported overhearing Agatha telling bedtime stories to her children that she described as unwholesome and frightening, involving children who harbored demons of disobedience that needed to be drawn out through the skin. When the maid expressed concern to Thaddius, she was dismissed the following day. Her report to the police came only after the disappearance of the 3rd child, by which time the Lockwoods had already departed for California. The coincidental timing of their departure and the abandonment of their comfortable life for the harshness of Death Valley suggested a flight not just from financial ruin, but from something potentially more sinister. What happened in the isolated house in the years that followed can only be pieced together from fragments: the partial journal found beneath the floorboards, the physical evidence left behind in that terrible room, and a handful of local accounts. The journal, written in what graphologists later confirmed was Thaddius's hand, provides a harrowing glimpse into the family's disintegration. The entries begin in 1880, 5 years after their arrival in Death Valley, by which time it appears Agatha's influence over the household had become absolute. A insists the children show signs of corruption, one entry reads. She keeps them isolated in their rooms for days at a time, permitting them to emerge only for her cleansing sessions. Franklin showed resistance last week and has since been confined to the special room. His screams have finally stopped, which A says is a sign the treatment is working. I find I cannot look him in the eye anymore. What kind of father have I become? Another entry, dated 3 months later. A now believes the corruption spreads through physical contact. We no longer take meals together. The children are fed separately and are forbidden to touch one another. Elizabeth attempted to hold her brother's hand during yesterday's recitation session. A saw this and subjected her to 6 hours in the chair. The child's wrists were rubbed raw by the restraints. When I attempted to intervene, A reminded me of Boston, and I found myself retreating like a coward. The most disturbing entry comes from October of 1883. I discovered today that A has begun removing small portions of the children's flesh, minute cuttings from behind their ears or between their toes, places not readily visible. She preserves these specimens in small jars of alcohol, labeling each with the sin she claims to have extracted. Franklin's jar contains no fewer than 26 specimens. She calls this her physical documentation of spiritual progress. The children no longer cry out during these procedures. Something has gone out of them, the light in their eyes, the natural animation of youth. They move and speak only when directed. They are becoming like her dolls. The final entry, dated January 12, 1884, approximately 1 month before Franklin's death, is perhaps the most chilling. A has begun speaking of final purification. She says F is nearly ready for the procedure. I asked what this entails, and her explanation has left me sleepless for 3 nights. I have hidden a derringer in my boot and plan to take the children tonight while she sleeps. God forgive me for waiting so long. Whatever escape Thaddius planned apparently failed. No further entries appear in the journal, and within weeks, Franklin was dead. The physical evidence discovered in the room tells its own grim story. The chair with its restraints, the scratched walls, some marks deep enough to suggest fingernails worn to the quick, the dolls, with their human hair and cloth cuttings, and perhaps most tellingly, the hidden compartment discovered beneath the floorboards, which contained not only Thaddius's journal, but also a collection of small glass jars, each carefully labeled with a name, a date, and a sin, jars containing small fragments of preserved human tissue. Laboratory analysis conducted discreetly by a medical researcher at the University of California in 1915 confirmed the human origin of the samples. The researcher's private correspondence with Marsh, found among her papers after her death, expressed horror not just at the nature of the specimens, but at their number and meticulous cataloging. What you have sent me represents years of systematic mutilation, small portions taken repeatedly from multiple individuals. The precision of the cut suggests medical knowledge or, at minimum, a steady, practiced hand. The fate of the Lockwood children, except for Franklin, whose death was documented if not properly investigated, remains unknown. No graves were found on the property, despite extensive searching by Marsh and others who later became involved in the investigation. The most haunting question, however, concerns Agatha herself. What became of the Lockwood Matriarch after that final sighting by the hunting party in November of 1885? No death certificate exists. No record places her anywhere else in the country. The house, when discovered by the historians in 1897, appeared to have been abandoned for many years, yet showed no signs of forced entry or disturbance, as if its last occupant had simply walked away, locking the door behind her. Some answers came from an unexpected source in 1912, when Eleanor Marsh tracked down Agatha's sister, Constance Reed, to a convent in Northern California where she had lived in seclusion for over 30 years. Reed, by then an elderly woman, initially refused to discuss her sister or the events at the Lockwood house. It was only when Marsh showed her one of the cloth dolls recovered from the room that the woman's composure shattered. "She made one for each of us," Reed whispered, her hands trembling as she touched the crude figure. Said they helped her focus her prayers for our purification. She kept them arranged in a circle in her private room, moving them closer to or farther from the center, depending on our spiritual progress, as she measured it. Reed confirmed that Agatha had been institutionalized in her youth after attempting to purify a young cousin by restraining him and cutting away corrupted flesh. She claimed harbored demons. The family had kept the incident quiet, using their influence to have her treated privately rather than criminally charged. The doctors claimed they had cured her, Reed said. Thaddius believed it, or convinced himself he did. I went with them to California because I feared for the children, but Agatha grew worse in isolation, not better. The desert fed her madness, somehow. According to Reed, Agatha became obsessed with the idea that human sin manifested physically in the body and could be systematically removed through a combination of isolation, recitation of purifying texts, and the literal cutting away of corrupted flesh. She started with tiny portions, Reed recalled, so small you could barely see them, a sliver from behind the ear, a fragment of skin between the toes, places that wouldn't show. She told the children it was necessary for their salvation, that she was saving them from eternal torment. Reed described how Agatha's methods escalated over time. The children were increasingly isolated, forbidden from touching one another or even speaking without permission. Thaddius, initially resistant, gradually succumbed to Agatha's influence, partly out of fear, Reed believed, and partly out of a desperate hope that submission would protect his children from more extreme measures. He became a shadow, she said, following Agatha's instructions, enforcing her rules, watching as she hurt them. Perhaps he thought his presence somewhat moderated her. Perhaps he was simply a coward. I don't know which is worse. Reed herself fled the house in 1879 after discovering what she called the special room, where Agatha conducted her most intensive purifications. I found Franklin strapped to the chair, she said. He'd been there for 3 days. Agatha sat before him, reciting her texts, occasionally using a small silver blade to remove a tiny piece of his skin, which he would carefully preserve in a jar. The boy no longer cried or struggled. His eyes were empty. When I tried to free him, Agatha flew into a rage unlike anything I'd seen. She said I was interfering with God's work, that I too was corrupt and would need purification. Reed escaped that night and made her way to San Francisco, where she sought help from authorities. But her story of a mad woman systematically torturing her family in a remote desert house was dismissed as hysteria. When officials finally agreed to investigate months later, they reported finding nothing amiss at the Lockwood property. The family appeared normal, if reclusive, and the children, while quiet, showed no obvious signs of abuse. Agatha was clever, Reed explained. She knew how to present a facade of normalcy when needed, and the children, by then, they were too afraid to speak, or perhaps too broken. Reed had no further contact with the family after her escape. She retreated to the convent in 1880, where she lived in self-imposed penance for what she viewed as her failure to save her niece and nephews. Her final revelation to Marsh was, perhaps, the most disturbing. Agatha believed there was ultimate purification, a final removal of sin that would perfect the soul by releasing it from corrupt flesh entirely. She spoke of it only once, but I never forgot her words. When all the corrupt portions have been documented and removed, what remains must be separated completely so that the purified spirit can ascend. I believe she meant to take them apart entirely, piece by piece, once she had determined they were ready. Reed died in 1913, less than a year after her interview with Marsh. The nuns reported that in her final days, she was tormented by visions of children with missing pieces, calling to her for help. Marsh's investigation took an unexpected turn in 1915 when she discovered a series of unsolved disappearances along the eastern border of California between 1886 and 1900, nearly 30 cases of solitary travelers who had vanished while journeying through the region near Death Valley. Most were dismissed by authorities as victims of the harsh desert environment or possible criminal activity from bandits known to haunt remote trails. But Marsh noted a disturbing pattern. Many of the disappearances occurred during the cooler months, when survival in the desert was more feasible, and several of the last known locations clustered along trails within a day's walk of the abandoned Lockwood property. Even more disturbing was what Marsh found when she began tracking down personal effects recovered from the missing travelers, items later found abandoned in the desert, or in one case, discovered by a prospector in a small cave. 3 of these collections included personal journals or letters in which the writers described encountering a tall, gaunt woman who offered them shelter or assistance. One man, a mineral surveyor named James Harden, wrote to his wife on October 3, 1892, "Have met the strangest woman out here in this wasteland. She calls herself a widow and lives alone in a large house some miles from the main trail. She has offered me shelter for the night, which I have accepted, as a storm threatens." There is something unsettling in her manner of speaking. She asks many questions about my spiritual beliefs and seems particularly concerned with whether I feel purified by my time in the desert. The house is immaculate, but feels wrong somehow, as if it were a stage set rather than a home. I shall leave at first light. Harden was never seen again. His letter was found in a saddlebag discovered by a rancher nearly 6 months later, miles from where he had last been seen. Another traveler, a young woman named Sarah Collins, journeying to San Francisco in 1895, wrote in her diary of meeting an elderly woman of aristocratic bearing who invited her to rest at her home. Collins described the house as curiously decorated with small cloth figures arranged in patterns on various surfaces, and noted that her hostess insisted she drink a bitter tea to protect against desert fever. The diary entry ends abruptly mid-sentence. The book was discovered half buried in the sand 3 miles from the Lockwood property, along with Collins's emptied traveling case. The final piece of Marsh's investigation came in 1917, when she managed to locate and interview one of the historians who had discovered the Lockwood house 20 years earlier. Emmett Crawford, living in self-imposed exile in a small village in the French countryside, initially refused to discuss the discovery. It was only when Marsh showed him the progress of her investigation that he finally relented. "We didn't tell the whole truth in our report," he admitted. "We couldn't. No one would have believed us, and those who might have would only have been drawn there, to that place of contamination." According to Crawford, the historians had not simply discovered the room, documented it, and departed. They had encountered something in the house, something he still struggled to describe coherently. "We spent the night there," he said. "God help me, we were fools. We thought it would be more efficient to continue our documentation in the morning. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of someone moving in the hallway outside our room." Crawford described following the sound to the notorious room with its restraint chair, which they had left open after their initial discovery. There, he claimed to have seen a tall, impossibly thin figure arranging the cloth dolls in a circle. "She didn't acknowledge me at first," he said, "just continued her work with those horrible little effigies. Then, without turning, she asked if I had come to be purified. She said I had sin embedded in my flesh that needed to be extracted. She said she could see it, like dark threads running just beneath my skin." Crawford fled the room, waking his colleagues. They left immediately, despite the darkness. As they rode away, Crawford claimed to have looked back and seen a figure standing on the porch of the house, motionless, watching their retreat. "The next morning we all had fever," he said, "and the dreams began, dreams of being strapped to that chair, of a silver blade peeling away small portions of skin, of a woman's voice reciting nonsensical prayers as she worked. We agreed never to speak of what I had seen." We submitted the dolls and journal to the Historical Society, but omitted any mention of the figure in the house. We hoped it was a hallucination, a product of exhaustion, or the oppressive atmosphere of the place. But Crawford remained convinced that whoever he had seen that night, was real, and that it had somehow followed him, at least in his dreams, ever since. "She's still there," he insisted, "in that house, in that room. Or perhaps she wanders the desert, seeking new subjects for her purification. Either way, she isn't dead. I don't think she can die, not in any normal sense." Crawford took his own life 3 months after his interview with Marsh. His suicide note contained a single line: "She's coming to collect the corrupt parts of me." Marsh herself vanished in 1919 during a final expedition to the Lockwood property. Her research notes were discovered in her abandoned automobile, parked at the head of the trail leading to the house. A search party followed her presumed path, but found no trace of the researcher or, strangely, of the Lockwood house itself. Where the imposing two-story structure had once stood, they found only an empty stretch of desert with no foundation, no debris, no evidence that a building had ever existed there. It was as if the house, like its inhabitants, had been swallowed by the sands of Death Valley. The dolls, journal, and other artifacts recovered by the original historians were reportedly stored in the archives of the California Historical Society. However, when researchers attempted to examine them following Marsh's disappearance, the items could not be located. Society records indicated they had been transferred to the Smithsonian Institution in 1900, but the Smithsonian had no record of receiving them. To this day, the ultimate fate of the Lockwood family and their terrifying matriarch remains unknown, but travelers in the remote regions of Death Valley occasionally report encountering a tall, gaunt woman who offers them shelter for the night. She is always alone, they say, and always asks the same question: "Have you come to be purified?" Few who accept her invitation are ever seen again. Those who decline and continue on their way often report being followed by the distant sound of a woman's voice, reciting what sounds like names over and over in the darkness behind them. The most recent confirmed sighting occurred in 1920, when a survey team working in the Funeral Mountains reported seeing an elderly woman standing motionless on a ridge, watching their camp from sunrise to sunset without moving. When they approached her position, they found no footprints in the loose soil of the ridge, despite the clear visibility of their own tracks. They did, however, find a small cloth doll, crude in its construction, with a single human hair wrapped around it and a name tag sewn into its chest. The name was Eleanor Marsh. The doll was submitted to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office as potential evidence in Marsh's disappearance, but it vanished from their evidence room less than a week later. The deputy who last handled it took a leave of absence shortly thereafter, citing recurrent nightmares in which he was restrained in a chair while small pieces of his skin were methodically removed by a woman who explained in a calm, emotionless voice that she was helping to purify his corrupt soul. He never returned to work. His landlady reported that he had left abruptly one night after claiming to see a tall, thin woman standing outside his window, watching him with unblinking eyes. The Lockwood case file was officially closed in 1922, with all disappearances attributed to the harsh desert environment and the natural dangers faced by solitary travelers in remote regions. Eleanor Marsh was listed among these unfortunate victims, with a notation suggesting she had likely become disoriented and succumbed to exposure. No further official investigations were conducted, and over time, the story of the Lockwood family and their matriarch's ghastly room faded from public memory, just another dark legend whispered around campfires in the shadow of Death Valley. But even today, rangers and guides warn visitors not to venture too far off established trails, especially as dusk approaches. They speak vaguely of disorientation and environmental hazards, of the risks inherent in desert travel. They do not mention the tall figure occasionally glimpsed standing motionless on distant ridges, watching. They do not speak of the crude dolls sometimes found half buried in the sand, each bearing a name tag and a single human hair. And they certainly never repeat the stories told by the few travelers who claim to have encountered an elderly woman living alone in a house that, according to all official records, does not exist. A woman who invites them in, offers them bitter tea, and asks if they have come to be purified. Some stories, it seems, are better left untold, some histories better left buried beneath the shifting sands of Death Valley. Yet the desert preserves its secrets well. And somewhere yet the desert preserves its secrets well. And somewhere, in the vast emptiness of Death Valley, perhaps that house still stands, its room silent, its terrible chair empty, waiting for new subjects to purify. Or perhaps Agatha Lockwood still wanders the arid landscape, her tall figure barely distinguishable from the twisted desert vegetation, searching for travelers who stray from marked paths. The Journal of Thaddius Lockwood partially recovered from beneath the floorboards of that ghastly room, contains one final entry, scrawled hastily in the margins of an otherwise blank page, the handwriting barely recognizable as his. The entry is undated, but appears to have been written after his documented final entry of January 12, 1884. She knows what I intended. God help us all. She says Franklin is ready for final purification tonight. I cannot stop her alone. She is not human anymore. I do not think she ever was. What exactly Thaddius meant by these words remains a matter of speculation, but perhaps the most disturbing theory comes from Dr. William Blackwood, a distant relative of Agatha's, who agreed to speak with researchers in 1916 after learning of Eleanor Marsh's investigation. Dr. Blackwood, a physician specializing in mental disorders, had access to family records normally kept private. According to these documents, Agatha's mother had died shortly after her birth, not from complications of childbirth, as was publicly claimed, but under mysterious circumstances that the family took great pains to conceal. The private family correspondence suggests something far more troubling than a mere postpartum death, Dr. Blackwood explained. There are references to the infant Agatha being found in her crib, covered in blood, with her mother nearby, deceased from what appeared to be multiple small incisions. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, none individually fatal, but collectively resulting in exsanguination. The incident was documented by the family physician, but never reported to authorities. The official cause of death was listed as childbed fever, a common and unquestioned diagnosis in the early 19th century. Agatha was raised by her father and a succession of governesses, all of whom departed under unclear circumstances after relatively short periods of employment. The family believed, though they would never state it publicly, that whatever afflicted Agatha was inherited, Dr. Blackwood continued. There are earlier cases in the family history, incidents described in euphemistic terms, but clearly pointing to similar behaviors. A great-aunt who was kept in a private wing of the family estate after allegedly attempting to cleanse household staff. A grandfather who disappeared into the wilderness after his wife and children were found, with small portions of their bodies methodically removed. The Blackwood family had, for generations, managed to conceal these disturbing incidents through their wealth and social position. Agatha's institutionalization came only after her attempts to purify a young cousin became impossible to hide. And even then, the family used their influence to ensure the matter was handled as a medical rather than criminal issue. The most unsettling suggestion in the family records, Dr. Blackwood concluded, is that this behavior, this compulsion to remove small portions of human flesh in a ritualistic manner, was not merely a psychological disturbance, but something the afflicted individuals genuinely believed was necessary. They described hearing voices, experiencing visions, receiving divine instruction, and they reported a physical sensation, an ability to see corruption beneath the skin of others, like dark threads or stains that needed to be extracted. Whether Agatha Lockwood was suffering from a hereditary mental illness, as her distant relatives suggested, or whether something more inexplicable was at work in that isolated Death Valley house, the historical record provides no definitive answer. What remains are only fragments: the journal, the terrible room with its restraint chair, the dolls with their human hair and name tags, and the trail of disappearances stretching across decades. The final mystery of the Lockwood case concerns a series of unusual deaths that occurred between 1917 and 1920 among those who had investigated or come into contact with artifacts from the Lockwood house. In addition to Emmett Crawford's suicide and Eleanor Marsh's disappearance, 5 other individuals connected to the case died under circumstances that some considered suspicious. The medical researcher who examined the preserved tissue samples succumbed to a wasting illness that doctors could neither identify nor treat. The deputy who handled the cloth doll disappeared, as previously noted. 2 clerks at the California Historical Society who assisted Marsh in accessing the sealed records died within months of each other, one from what was officially ruled a self-inflicted wound consisting of dozens of small cuts, none individually fatal but collectively resulting in exsanguination. The other after reportedly sleepwalking off the roof of his apartment building. Most disturbing was the fate of Dr. William Blackwood, who, 6 months after sharing his family's records with researchers, was found in his office, seated in his chair, surrounded by a circle of crude cloth dolls. His body bore evidence of systematic self-mutilation, small portions of skin methodically removed over what appeared to be several weeks. A journal found on his desk contained increasingly incoherent entries describing dark threads beneath the skin and the necessity of purification. The final page held a single coherent sentence: "She comes at night to guide my hand." These deaths and disappearances led to rumors of what some called the Lockwood Curse, the belief that merely investigating the case or handling artifacts connected to it placed one at risk. This superstition effectively ended formal research into the matter by 1922, when the San Bernardino County Sheriff officially closed the file. In the century since, the story of Agatha Lockwood and her ghastly room has largely faded from public knowledge, preserved only in obscure historical journals, and the cautious warnings of longtime Death Valley residents. Yet, occasionally, new chapters are added to the legend. In 1942, a military training exercise in the Death Valley region was reportedly abandoned after 3 soldiers disappeared while on a routine patrol. Their equipment was discovered scattered across a half-mile of desert, but no bodies were ever recovered. The incident was officially attributed to desertion, despite the soldiers' exemplary records and the fact that their personal belongings, including wallets and identification, were found among the abandoned equipment. One of the search party members later claimed they had discovered a single boot print in the sand. A woman's narrow foot, he insisted, though his superiors dismissed this as imagination or misidentification. More telling was what he kept to himself until years later. Near the boot print, a small cloth doll with a single human hair wrapped around it and 3 name tags sewn into its chest, one for each missing soldier. In 1968, a geological survey team reported finding the foundation of a large house in an area where no structures were documented. By the time a follow-up team arrived to investigate, no trace of the foundation could be located, and the initial report was dismissed as an error. 2 members of the original team subsequently requested transfers out of the region, refusing to explain their sudden desire to leave. Most recently, in 1998, a backpacker recovered from severe dehydration after being found wandering disoriented in a remote area of Death Valley National Park. During his hospitalization, he repeatedly described being invited to take shelter in a large old house occupied by an elderly woman who insisted on serving him tea and asked repeatedly if he had come to be purified. He claimed to have fled during the night after waking to find the woman standing over his bed with what he described as a small silver blade. Park rangers searching the area where the backpacker was found reported no structures of any kind, abandoned or otherwise. The incident was attributed to hallucinations brought on by heat exhaustion and dehydration. Yet when the backpacker's belongings were returned to him, he became hysterical upon discovering a small cloth doll tucked into the bottom of his pack, a doll he insisted had not been there before, with a single strand of his own hair wrapped around it, and a name tag sewn into its chest. The National Park Service has no official position on these incidents or on the Lockwood legend generally. When asked, rangers will acknowledge only that Death Valley is a harsh environment that presents numerous natural hazards to unprepared visitors. They emphasize the importance of staying on marked trails, carrying adequate water, and informing someone of one's intended route and expected return time. They do not mention the tall figure occasionally glimpsed standing motionless on distant ridges. They do not speak of the cloth dolls, sometimes found half buried in the sand. And they certainly never repeat the stories told by the few visitors who claim to have encountered an elderly woman living alone in a house that, according to all official records, does not exist. Some stories, after all, are better left untold, some histories better left buried beneath the shifting sands of Death Valley. But for those who venture into the remote reaches of that desolate landscape, a word of caution. Should you encounter a tall, gaunt woman who offers you shelter for the night, who serves you bitter tea and asks if you have come to be purified, do not accept her invitation. Continue on your way, no matter the hour or the weather. Do not look back, even if you hear footsteps following behind you, or a woman's voice reciting names in the darkness. For the desert preserves its secrets well. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of Death Valley, Agatha Lockwood waits, her terrible chair empty, her silver blade ready, her collection of cloth dolls incomplete. She can see the corruption beneath your skin, the dark threads that need to be extracted, the portions that must be removed for your purification to begin, and she is very, very patient. A handwritten note discovered in 1920 among Eleanor Marsh's effects, apparently composed shortly before her final expedition to the Lockwood property. I dream of her almost nightly now. She stands at the foot of my bed, tall and thin, her eyes never blinking. She tells me I am nearly ready for purification. I have begun to notice something strange, dark threads beneath the skin of my hands, like tiny veins of corruption. I can see them clearly in certain light. She says she can remove them for me. She says it is the only way to be clean. I am returning to the house tomorrow, not to continue my research, though that is what I have told my colleagues. I go because she has called me, and I find I cannot resist. Perhaps there, in that ghastly room, I will finally understand what happened to the Lockwoods, what happened to all the others, what is happening to me. If you are reading this, I likely will not return. Do not come looking for me. Do not approach the house. Above all, if you encounter her, Agatha Lockwood, the matriarch, the purifier, do not accept her invitation. Do not drink her tea. Do not allow her to see the corruption beneath your skin. Run. Run while you still can. The note was officially classified as evidence of Marsh's deteriorating mental state in the days before her disappearance. It was filed away and forgotten, like so many other fragments of the Lockwood story. But perhaps somewhere in the vast archives of the California Historical Society, or in a dusty evidence room in San Bernardino County, or half buried in the shifting sands of Death Valley itself, other fragments remain, waiting to be discovered by those foolish or brave enough to seek them out. The story of the Lockwood Matriarch and her ghastly room may never be fully told. Perhaps it is better that way. For some truths, once known, cannot be unknown. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and some purifications, once begun, must be carried through to their terrible conclusion.